This leadership mini-series is kindly sponsored by Minerva. Minerva is an executive search firm that works primarily with higher education clients to develop outstanding teams, cultures and structures. Minerva supports universities in making senior executive appointments across academic and professional services roles and in recruiting to non-executive and interim positions. Minerva's consultants also help individuals in the sector and outside find their best path through a career in the sector. Since 2020, 5 cohorts have passed through Minerva's Emerging Leaders programme that works with people in a critical development stage of their leadership and management careers, including heads, deans, deputies and directors. Minerva also runs Aspire, a pro bono leadership development programme to help maximise opportunities for talented minority ethnic professionals to enrich their careers, and Board Prospects, an initiative to provide people from underrepresented backgrounds with experience of governance. I'm Susanna Marsden, a higher education consultant who helps to develop and support HE institutions in the UK and beyond. This podcast takes a deep dive into the roles of people who work in this hugely varied higher education sector. Each episode reveals what's involved in a specific role, the career path that led to it, and tips on how to get in and get on in these jobs. My guest in this episode is Jim Irving, Pro Vice-Chancellor Students and Governance at Southampton Solent University. Jim has developed his higher education career over the past 25 years across a series of progressively senior posts. In this episode, Jim reflects on his leadership path so far and delves into a range of topics, including what motivated him to pursue a career in higher education leadership, successfully navigating relationships across an institution, and how he's responded to times that have been professionally tough. He also discusses the art of leading through influence and the importance of supporting emerging leaders of the future. Jim, thanks for being my guest today and welcome to this Job Shadowing HE Leadership Reflections mini-series. You're Pro Vice-Chancellor for Students and Governance at Southampton Solent University, a post you've held for just over 3 years. Can you give us an overview of what your role involves?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. So, as Pro Vice-Chancellor Students and Governance, I've got a broad portfolio which essentially covers 3 areas. Firstly, our student success services, which include things like student mental health and wellbeing support, disability, student funding, careers, student achievement, and our student hub, which is our first point of contact for students. Second, I oversee our academic and student administration services. So that's everything from enrolment through to graduation, including quality assurance, assessment, complaints and appeals, and so on. And I should say in the last couple of years, we've delivered a new student record system in this space, which is something I'd sworn I would never want to do in my career, but it actually went very well. And finally, I lead our legal governance and compliance activities. And in that space, I'm the university secretary. So I'm responsible for ensuring our corporate governance is functioning effectively, that we have robust compliance, that we coordinate our external audit activity, and our information rights and legal services. I'm also the university's data protection officer, the lead officer for UKVI. I manage the Vice-Chancellor's office. I chair and attend more committees than I really would care to mention. And I'm executive lead for our relationship with Students' Union. So it's a really broad role through which I've recently been working with our Vice-Chancellor to coordinate the development of our next strategic plan. But I really love the role.
Looking back, what's been your career path leading up to the role you have now, and to what extent was it planned?
I've been working in higher education for very nearly 25 years, but it was an entirely unplanned career, really. So when I was at school, what I really wanted to be was an architect. And I had a teacher who was almost the opposite of the inspirational teacher story. I had a teacher who sat me down and said, Jim, your maths is really not good enough. You will never cut it as an architect. So I had to have a bit of a rethink. And I left school and went to university without really knowing what I wanted to do. And at the time, I'd done reasonably well in sort of humanities space and in English literature. So I thought, well, I'd go and study that as an undergraduate degree. And through that route, I had the opportunity to do an optional module in early British cinema. That gave me a real passion for film and film history. And I was fortunate enough to get Arts and Humanities Research Board funding to do a postgraduate degree. And for a brief moment, I thought what I'd really love to do is to research and to teach. And when I got that funding, it had a number of conditions, one of which was that I couldn't work. And it was probably the first time since I'd been 16 where I hadn't had some form of part-time work or some form of job. And I absolutely hated it. And so again, I had to have a bit of a rethink. And I ended up as a course administrator for the course where I'd done my undergraduate degree. And I had absolutely no idea what that was going to entail. But I really enjoyed working with students, working with academic colleagues, and sort of feeling that I was making a bit of a difference. But in that role, I was slightly underutilized, and I found myself in that sort of position where I was creating ways of doing things that really weren't needed, but as a way of filling my time. And from there, I fell into another role. So I started looking at where I'd like to progress and what I'd like to do. And without any knowledge of timetabling whatsoever, I applied for a role as a timetabling coordinator. And that was a really eye-opening experience. I spent a couple of years there and went from there to another timetabling role. And this was about the time where a number of universities had implemented auto-scheduling in their timetables, and their timetables had nearly fallen over. So I went to another well-known institution where their timetable had very nearly fallen over with about 2 weeks to go before the start of the academic year. And I had the job of trying to work through the processes and reset all of that, which was, it's a really good way of learning to be resilient, I would say, is working in timetabling, because it's not a popular area of the institution. And from there, I've just had different opportunities to acquire more skills through restructure or through organisational change. So in that institution, we went through a change programme, and through that, I was able to become a faculty registrar. And from there, there was an opportunity at another institution to be a director of registry, which I didn't feel I was ready for, but I thought, well, I'll put my hat in the ring, see what happens. And I got that role, and again, really enjoyed working across the institution in that space. And again, through a restructure, somebody moved on, and there was an opportunity to move into the student services space. So I took that on and became a deputy academic registrar. Then moved to become an academic registrar, and then finally landed up at Southampton Solent University, where, as you say, I've been for 3 years.
And picking up on that title, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor title that you hold, I mean, it's a title that's traditionally been reserved for senior academic posts. But, you know, as we've heard just there from your career story, you followed a professional services route into that role. But if we go back 5 years and certainly 10 years, I doubt it would be possible to find senior professional services colleagues with that role title. And now there's certainly, I don't know, at least a handful of PVCs in the sector with professional services backgrounds. What would you say is changing within the sector to make that happen? And is it breaking down the academic and professional services career pathway silos, or do you think those still remain distinct?
It is a really interesting question, and I don't think there is a single answer to it. So I think in the career history that I've just described, I've worked in 6 higher education institutions which cover a really broad spectrum of our sector. So from research intensive to teaching intensive, from large to small, from north to south, and perhaps most importantly, from institutions facing very different challenges with regard to financial sustainability and their context. And it's probably the financial sustainability that is perhaps prompting some change within the sector at the moment, because it is really narrowing down our focus on the priorities that we need to have in sight. But I would say the use of the Pro-Vice-Chancellor title in my current institution is really led by the fact that we've got a flat and collaborative leadership structure. So we typically work in a matrix approach in terms of our leadership function and the way that we deliver activities across the institution. And although we also have chief officer roles within our executive team, everybody carries the Pro-Vice-Chancellor title. For me, and this is a really personal view, the PVC title carries more relevance and resonance within the sector than the chief officer title, certainly within my area of the sector, I would suggest. And I see that because I see my role as is enabling and supporting our academic endeavour. I work in partnership with our PVCs leading on education and on research and knowledge exchange. And we have to be working synchronously. And I think when you're working in an executive team, you are first and foremost leaders and managers of a multi-million pound organisation, multi-million pound business. And whilst we might have all worked through different tracks to make our way onto that leadership team, we share the goal of ensuring the ongoing sustainability and the ongoing impact of our institutions. But sort of returning to the substance of your question, I think it's really important for professional service colleagues across the sector to also see people with professional service backgrounds moving into roles that carry these titles, because there's an element there about representation and visibility. And I'm always acutely aware of the opportunities and lack of barriers, in fact, that I've had through my life by virtue of simply being born a white man and having experienced what I would characterize as a middle class upbringing. But, for example, I'm also a gay man, and I see that I have a duty to be a visible gay leader because I want other people to have the ability to be authentic and to be themselves in the workplace, and to see other people being sort of carrying that authenticity. Bringing that back to professional services colleagues having that sort of visible career trajectory to a PVC role, I think it's really important for me to talk about these leadership roles and about the skills and experience that you can take through, regardless of whether you're following the academic path or the professional services path, because everybody has the opportunity to move into that leadership space through the development of those skills. I would also reflect, I mean, I've been now involved in 2 processes to recruit Vice-Chancellors. So I've coordinated a process to recruit a Vice-Chancellor, and I've been involved in a separate process. And it's really interesting how we tackle the question of credibility, because there is absolutely a debate for these senior leadership roles as to whether somebody needs to be an active researcher or an active academic in order to carry that credibility as a leader of an academic institution. And I think, again, I might point out that first and foremost, we are running and we are responsible for the sustainability of really significant and complex businesses. And we've got to have the sort of that sustainability for our students, for our staff at the core of what we do. And I dare say I might argue that skill set is the one that features first and foremost. And clearly it's important that you've got the breadth of knowledge, of understanding of the different ways that people work. But we have to be able to lead and manage.
You talked a bit earlier about flat and collaborative senior leadership structures, and I want to pick up more broadly about working in partnership across an institution. Now, across your career, as you've talked about already, you've worked in different posts and in different parts of an institution. What reflections do you have about navigating the dynamics of the local central axis that exists in many institutions?
Yeah, I mean, I've reflected on different points in my career where I've experienced perhaps some challenge in that space, in the dynamics between the local and central, or between the professional service and the academic community, or between different parts of an organisation. And it really strikes me that we have to kind of proactively break down these barriers. Relatively early in my career, I worked at an institution where on my second day in the role, I went out to meet a head of department who sat me down and said, I want you to justify your role to me. And it felt fairly brutal at the time, but it was a really important lesson to me to be confident about the importance of my role and the value that I bring to an institution, and to recognize actually the individual values that we all bring and the individual roles that we all play within making an organization work effectively. I've seen many different examples of challenge within institutions over my career. And if I turn my mind back about 15 years, I was working in an organisation that went through a major restructure from 23 to 8 academic units. And through that process, we centralised or moved the administration away from being the person who sat at the end of the corridor and knew all of the academic team and made the tea as well as did the administration. But we had to move to a centralised model because actually we were investing more in administration than we were in the academic endeavour of the institution. But through that change, what I remember most clearly was sitting down with the head of department after the fact, and he seemed really lost. He said to me, "Jim, when I pull a lever now, nothing happens." And his concern was a sense of a loss of control and it's sort of the impact that would have for his students and for his colleagues. And it at the same time, the senior leadership of that organisation had sort of stepped back from the change project. So all of the effort and attention had been put into designing this structure with the new points of delivery, into communicating that, into getting that ready to go. And then on the 1st of August, when that happened, suddenly there was nobody there. And I was in the new role and I felt I had nobody immediately behind me. What it really taught me is that everything we do is first and foremost about people. And we've got to engage people in all stages of that change program and support them on that journey and listen to them. And when they tell you that they're feeling a loss of control, understand the impact of that and try to mitigate that. So whenever I start in a new role or a new organization, the first thing I do is meet as many people as possible and sit down and just listen to what they've got to say. And what's really interesting is when I was asked about that at an interview at one point in my career, it's really difficult to articulate how you do that well and why that's important. But it's fundamental to understanding how an organisation works. And again, if I link very briefly back to the sort of the timetabling piece and that example, when I first moved into the timetabling space, I lived in fear of being pushed down the stairs. I thought, if somebody was having such a bad experience of their timetable, so unhappy about being scheduled at a wrong time that they were going to not actually, but this perception that you were just the most unpopular person on campus. But it's because you have a really direct impact on people's lives, and it's really important to understand that impact. That colleagues will have caring responsibilities, that students will have caring responsibilities, and other things going on in their lives, which means that actually for them 5 p.m. on a Tuesday is a really bad time, or 9 a.m. on a Thursday is a really bad time, and everybody will have a different perception, so you're not going to please people, but the best thing you can do is try and understand them.
Listening to you talking about your career path at the start of the episode, it seems to have gone really smoothly for you, moving from one role to another across several institutions and now into a university executive role. But however smooth someone's career path looks on the surface, there's often a more challenging story sitting behind it, with periods of time that may have been, confusing or tough. What do those moments look like in your career so far, and how did you go about getting through them?
Yeah, there have been moments where I've wanted the ground to swallow me up. Things haven't gone as smoothly as I'd hoped. What I'd like to talk about is just a couple of examples of things that I think we don't speak about when we talk about career journeys, which are the instances where you've applied for roles and been unsuccessful. And there have been a number of times in my career where I've been through an interview process, or I've started a process and have not secured the job, not been successful. And it can be really denting to your confidence because you put a huge amount of time and investment into applying for a role, into learning about an organisation, and then ultimately you're going to be disappointed because there's one role and usually 4 or 5 candidates who are in the mix for it. And I think where I look back at the times that I've been unsuccessful, they've fallen into 2 broad categories. So the first is that I've really messed up somewhere along the way. Either I'd picked the wrong role, or I'd given a bad interview, or I'd done poor preparation. And the second category is the kind of, it's not me, it's them. And it seems a really conceited thing, but it never fails to surprise me how often when we're recruiting colleagues to an organisation, we fail to understand that's a two-way process. And I'd say the times that really stick with me where it hasn't worked are where I feel that the recruiting organisation has perhaps not really understood the impact that they have on candidates who have applied to work with them. And I think when I look back, there's one instance where I turned down a role that I was offered, and there are two occasions where I absolutely would have turned down a role had I been offered it. And it's when you say that after the fact, it can sound quite bitter, as if, well, of course I wouldn't have accepted it. But it's quite a genuine thing, because you never want to be in that position with the time and the investment you put into recruitment to find that you have a candidate who doesn't actually want to work with you or work with the organisation. And for me, the reason that didn't work out, if I take one of those examples, it was before I was moving into my current role. I was looking for new roles, and I went through a process where I was applying for a senior role, but it didn't include, as part of that process, an opportunity to meet with students or governors. And students sit at the heart of what we do. I wherever possible, I will create an opportunity for candidates who are coming to work with me to meet students as part of the process. And I think when you're working at executive level, not to include governors in the process seems slightly lacking. So there were elements that were missing that didn't allow me to build the full picture of the organisation. When it came to the interview day, I'd done a huge amount of preparation for the interview day, and I had to give a presentation to a group of stakeholders. I was met really nicely. The colleagues who supported me on the day were absolutely lovely, but they walked me into a room where the setup of the room for me to give a presentation and to facilitate a discussion was a very small seminar room with about 25 chairs in a circle around the edge, and I was stood in the middle, feeling very exposed in front of this group of colleagues. And I don't know how well they'd been briefed about the presentation that I'd been asked to do, but I gave a sort of very to the point presentation that I felt had answered the question I'd been given, and then opened it up to try and facilitate a discussion. And the first question that I got was completely different to the presentation. It focused on a very different topic and was quite hostile. And it was an organisation that was going through quite a difficult change programme. So I understood that colleagues were feeling a little bit vulnerable. But it was very difficult to field that question and to engage in discussion. But I went through that and managed to get through that part of the process. And then when I came to the interview itself, I walked into the room and I could feel that the panel were bored. They'd had a long day. They were getting tired, and there was just a slight lack of energy. So it wasn't the warmest of welcomes into the room. And again, we're all human, and we kind of recognise that happens. So I was sort of trying to bring some enthusiasm, deliver the presentation again, really take them with me on that journey. But it just didn't land. And the questions that I was being asked, again, there was no conversation, there was no dialogue. It was a question on a page with no sort of probing or follow-up. And I think that colleagues are at their best when you can get that conversation going. So it may be a personal preference piece. But the thing that really stuck with me at the end was that I wasn't even shown out of the interview room. The interview ended quite abruptly, and I had to sort of find my way out, find the next colleague who was meeting me to take me on a tour, and do the next thing. And this is at an organisation where some of the individuals involved in that process are known for being really empathetic, really good leaders, and we all have our off days, and clearly I didn't perform at the best in that process, but I didn't feel I had the opportunity to perform at my best. And I think the contrast to that is that in my current role at Southampton Solent University, if I kind of go back a number of years, before I'd applied for my previous role, I'd applied to be academic registrar at Southampton Solent University many years ago, and I was unsuccessful in that process. I got through to the final two, But for various reasons, I wasn't the right candidate, didn't have the right level of experience. But the organisation at the time really made an effort to make contact with me, to phone me, to give me really good feedback. And I remembered that. I remembered the conversations that I'd had. And so when the next opportunity came up, I was really, really keen to apply for that, even though it meant moving 200 miles down the country. I knew it was an organisation that I'd want to work with. Whereas on that previous example, I didn't even really get any feedback from the interview process or the day. I was unsuccessful, but never really found out why, other than there was something about the fit with the organisation. And so I think remembering people at the heart of this is absolutely the clearest thing. And when things don't go well, we've got to bring it back to that people focus.
You said earlier that you never intended to progress a career in higher education, and yet the last 20 plus years show what you've achieved. At what point would you say that you knew leadership in higher education was what you wanted to pursue? And what was your motivation for that?
I think when I look back, there's probably only been one point in my career where I've had an active plan to be sort of a leader in higher education. And that came through working with a leader who I found quite inspirational. So I worked with an academic registrar who saw the best in me, and I could see them seeing the best in other people as well. They worked to understand their team. They worked to encourage their team, to support their team, and to challenge their team. So when we weren't at our best, we received good and direct feedback that really helped us to improve. But it was at that point, working with that individual, I really decided that actually I'd quite like to be an academic registrar. And I didn't know at that point what the role entailed. I knew that here was somebody who was a great role model for being very calm, very compassionate, very organised and on top of their brief. So I set myself at that point a goal of moving into that space without knowing very much about it. And I actually wrote a career plan at that point and looked at what are the skills that I had, where were my gaps. And I attended some training. I did some development around that. I actually achieved that goal 10 years ahead of the schedule that I'd artificially put in my mind, and then thought, oh dear, what do I do now? But I think what's motivated me throughout, or what's really caused me to pursue the career, is really a couple of things. I mean, I love working in higher education. I love seeing the impact that we have for students, for staff, for our communities. And I also, it's really important to me that I learn throughout from examples of good and, for examples of bad leadership that I've seen. And what I've done is try to adapt and learn from those leadership experiences and examples. And there is a fundamental motivation for me, which is about wanting to learn and about wanting to be better. And I think if I return to the point about architecture being my first passion, probably about 15 years ago, there was a Richard Rogers retrospective exhibition which I went to, and Richard Rogers, an architect, designed things like the Pompidou Centre, Lloyd's of London, things where the architecture is really visible, the functioning of the building is really visible on the outside. So it's really, for me, it really resonates. There was a quote in that exhibition which just replays for me time and time again, which was, I shall leave this city not less but more beautiful than I found it. And that quote comes from the Ephebic Oath, which was sworn by citizens of ancient Athens. And it's about a commitment to making a difference. It's about a social contract to say that I will do things that will have a positive impact and will leave things in a better place. And that's not always easy when you're dealing with compliance or with regulation, to think about how can I make things better. And in those cases, for me, it's about how do I minimize the worst impact of that whilst making sure the institution is in the best possible place. But I see myself wherever I work as a custodian of the university. I want to, for the time that I'm there, help move it on, leave it in a stronger place and a stronger position for students and staff. And I'd like to think that I make a small commitment in that way to the sector as well. I mean, this is a difference that we can only make together, but I hope that the actions I take leave things in a better place or a more beautiful place. And I don't know, perhaps the concept of beautiful administration is a stretch too far, but it's something that I'd like to pursue.
You've held leadership positions in several institutions, as you've talked about, and you've progressed significant change initiatives within each of those roles. How would you say your leadership of change has evolved in the past few years? And has that been due to your ongoing development as a leader or because of the more demanding nature of the sector?
Yeah, I think in answer to the last question first, it's both. I mean, our sector is a much more challenged and much more challenging place to work. I mean, we've seen the significant numbers of institutions who are operating in a deficit position. You know, we face into a challenge, and we continue to face into a challenge, which requires us to think creatively, but requires us also to take some really difficult decisions about change to make sure that our organisations survive and really continue to deliver that impact for society. And if I go back to my example of my inspirational leader, one of the things that they said to me fairly early in my career is that change will be constant throughout your career. And the thing that you can do is consider yourself as a change practitioner, is have the tools to support people through change, to deal with and respond to change in a resilient way. And one of the things I've noticed over the last few years is that we talk about change fatigue, and we've talked about the acceleration of change. And if we look at the experience of the pandemic, I think colleagues felt a real step up and a real shift in the volume of activity that we were doing. And maybe there was an expectation that that would step back down again as we came back out, but it hasn't. It's continued to accelerate, and it will only continue to accelerate, in my view. I think the pace of digital technological change, the drivers of our external environment, societal change, when we look at what's happening around the world, all of these things give us a picture where change will not ever stop. It will only accelerate. And we need to be sort of agile, and we need to continue to adapt. So I think we need to move people away from thinking about change fatigue and instead refocus it as change is the one thing that is constant in your career and the one thing that you can prepare and adapt for. And in terms of a sort of a personal approach, I think I have learned to act with more speed and to accept more risk. I mean, there are things which I would have done perfectly in the past because that would have been my motivation. But now I think, well, it has to be good enough. I think I'm probably also slightly less patient, and I try not to reflect that with colleagues. This is more about patience with myself. But I'm really clear with my team about what I need to operate at my best and to understand what they need to operate at their best. And for me to operate at my best, less is more. So I always talk to people about sending me emails with 3 bullet points or doing me a presentation with no more than 3 slides. I think we get lost in the detail, and as we look at that level of challenge that we're facing, having clarity of thought and having clarity of expression is really important. So being able to write succinctly and to be able to present succinctly is a real skill, and I think it's one that it's really important that people develop. So yeah, that's probably the change that I've seen.
Your Vice-Chancellor role means that you're in a privileged position of not only leading parts of the university, such as the services that sit within your domain, but also leading through influence. For example, advising the Vice-Chancellor, the governing body and the Students' Union. To what extent would you say that leading through influence is a hidden skill in higher education? And do you think we pay enough attention to its value in the professional development opportunities available to emerging leaders across the sector?
I was talking to a colleague about this recently. We were sort of reflecting on our career journeys and whether we'd ever been actively prepared to work at an executive level and to hold these kind of roles. And I think we both concluded that, yes, we'd had access to great training opportunities, but no, we hadn't ever really been prepared for the roles that we're doing. I hope I've made kind of clear in what I've said that I think people are the key to all of this. And I think leading through influence is the most critical skill, because it really is about understanding people and taking people on that journey and developing strong and effective working relationships across an organisation. And I think leading through influence requires capital, and that capital has to be built and it can't be wasted. So you have to take the time to develop working relationships with people, as I've said previously, to understand their motivations, to generate their respect and confidence in you. So, I think when I look to the governing body at my institution, they need to know that I really do understand my brief, and they need to have confidence that when I give them an answer to a question, I know what I'm talking about, and I'm delivering that with confidence. And I want to inspire confidence in others. So I think, when we face difficult situations, we need to be able to respond and react calmly, compassionately, and again support colleagues on the journey. So I would go back to the points I made earlier about the interview process being a two-way thing. I think all of the work that we do, the way that we support one another, and the way that we build leading through influence is about that two-way dialogue. It is about understanding people and understanding their motivations and working to that.
You're a highly visible advocate for the professional development of professional services colleagues across the sector. For example, the role you've taken in co-leading the Aspiring Academic Registrars programme, and you're also a trustee of the Association of Higher Education Professionals. What would you say are the current challenges to ensuring that we secure high-performing and happy professional services leaders of the future? And how do we go about addressing those challenges?
It's been a real privilege for me to be able to work with, previously with the Academic Registrars Council, now with the Association of Higher Education Professionals, because I absolutely love spending time with colleagues talking about our sector and talking about what they do and the impact that they have. I mean, the things I've spoken about, the challenges around change fatigue and moving from the concept of change as a one-off to being the norm, I think that's a key challenge for us within the sector. I think the acceleration of that change is a key challenge. And of course, I see the viability of the sector as a fundamental issue for us to face into. Whilst we in England, we might welcome the modest increase in the tuition fee. Really, that only offsets the cost of the national insurance increase. So we're going to have to continue to look at creative ways of working more efficiently and delivering more at lower cost, which is a really hard challenge, I think, for colleagues across all areas, but particularly in professional services. So I think we have to find increasing and different ways to recognize achievement. So finding ways other than money and finding ways other than financial reward to recognize and celebrate good performance. So within our own institution, we've done some work in the last year to relaunch our sort of staff awards and to re-engage colleagues in that process of recognizing achievement within their peers and sharing that good practice and having the opportunity to sort of own and talk about the things that people have done well. And I think in the absence of being able to perhaps give us the financial reward we might want to give, we really probably need to draw people back to that intrinsic motivation of why are we in higher education? The work that we do changes lives. It changes our students' lives. It changes our society. It changes our world. And it's a real privilege each year to attend graduation and to meet our graduating students and their parents, and to be reminded that we have students who experience such significant hardship in their student lives and in their lives, but they succeed and they see that benefit of higher education. They take that out and share that with others. It possibly sounds really trite, but I think really drawing that line to that motivation is the way that we can continue to engage colleagues and continue to ensure that we're happy in the work that we do.
Finishing up our conversation today, Jim, you've reached the position of being a Pro Vice-Chancellor. Is that the pinnacle of your own leadership development, or would you say leadership is still a learning process for you?
I am learning every single day, and I can tell you I will listen back to our conversation and think about the things that I should have said and the gaps in what I have said, and the things that were perhaps less than clear. I mean, most often I'm learning from what I get wrong, and I encourage a really open relationship with my colleagues, and I encourage feedback from my colleagues. So even though I am encouraging that, I'm human, and I sometimes find that difficult to hear. And I have colleagues who will tell me when they don't think that my response was good enough, or that they don't feel that I've supported them in quite the right way. But it's important that I can hear that, because that's the only way that I can continue to learn, continue to change, and continue to make a difference. I think when I look at the sector, possibly there are some specialisms in mergers and acquisitions that are going to be important for the future of our sector. And I'm not suggesting that's where my skills currently lie, or necessarily where I want them to lie. But there's very practical skill base that we can continue to develop. But I think I will find myself learning every single day of my life. I hope I will.
Jim, it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much for being a guest in this Leadership Reflections mini-series.
Thank you.
Job Shadowing HE was written and presented by Susanna Marsden, and you can find out more information about her consultancy work at susannamarsden.co.uk. Audio production and music was by me, Rhodri Marsden. Find out more about this podcast and hear previous episodes at jobshadowinghe.com.